Hey, big fucking dreamers. So pumped to be here with you today to talk about something that has been coming up with a few of my clients recently in sessions. And one of my clients actually told me in a one on one session, oh my God, I didn't have words for, I've never known that what I was going through was what you were describing. This is something called the Fawn Trauma Response. Now, I do want to caveat, of course, that I am not a therapist. This is not medical advice. If you are experiencing these things that I'm talking about as well, please seek out a licensed therapist. I think it's always good to caveat these things. Yet, while I do deal with a lot of people that have experienced trauma, which, a large majority of the population does, I do not treat trauma directly. And so today we're really going to dive into the fawn trauma response, but also how it shows up in your life and really how it shows up in corporate environments and how corporate environments benefit massively from the fawn trauma response. So, this is going to be really good for you if you feel like you are often the go to person, let's say the expert, the one who people always go to for everything, but potentially you don't really want to be in that role. Sometimes, how this shows up is you're actually quite senior, but you're doing tasks that a sometimes junior person could be doing because you've got to do it all. Everyone knows that you're super reliable. You could often say yes when you really mean no, when you're exhausted, when you're burned out. Everyone kind of praises you to be, this team player, and you're really loyal and you're leading all these ERGs and you're on all of these committees. But inside, you really wish that you could say no to more of these things, but it just doesn't seem like it's available to you. Sometimes a lot of happening is called the fawn trauma response. So a lot of people have heard of, fight, flight, freeze in a trauma response. Fawn is definitely one of the most misunderstood, and a lot of people don't actually know what it is. Dr. Ingrid Clayton just came out with a fantastic book. It's called Fawning. I will caveat it is quite hard to read at times because a lot of fawning is rooted in complex trauma. In order to understand people pleasing at a really in depth level, first we need to understand what complex trauma is. When people think of usually around PTSD, more of a single event. So something in your life happens, more of a traumatic event. And also, what's very interesting is that the same traumatic event could happen to two different people, but how it's responded to afterward, the care that you get, the nurturing that you get, the soothing that you get, the ability to process what has happened, that will determine if you have PTSD or not. So PTSD, a single event that happens, and then your brain has difficulty processing it. Complex trauma, on the other hand, was really coined by Judith Herman, who really realized that repeated traumas over and over, but not necessarily one big event, but there could be a lot of different micro events can sustain similar impacts of PTSD, and that's called complex PTSD. Now, the interesting thing is that in complex PTSD, it's all relational. So that usually means if someone has complex PTSD or CPTSD, it usually is because of relationships with primary caregivers. Let's say you were experienced to abuse or some sort of, repeated insults or verbal or physical abuse by a caregiver, something like that, or even sexual abuse, and that was sustained over a longer period of time. Now, complex trauma usually means if you have complex trauma, you're usually in a state of hypervigilance. So that will mean that you constantly are scanning for threats because your body was trained that way. You can always tell. I was listening to a podcast with Elizabeth Gilbert recently in Rich Roll, and Elizabeth Gilbert was talking about how she was so, one of her superpowers or trauma responses is going into a room, scanning for threats, being able to, seeing where the exits are, knowing what everyone's thinking and feeling, always trying to interpret things. And then Rich Roll very astutely said, "Oh, so you grew up in an alcoholic home?" And usually people with complex trauma will have a degree of hypervigilance because they are always aware. They always need to be aware of what's going on because they're scanning for danger. Then what happens is you develop a defense mechanism and really a protection mechanism where you are often pleasing, appeasing, enticing others as a need for survival. And when we talk about complex trauma, it's not like if your child's experiencing these things, and this is called adverse childhood experience or ACEs. So if you're a child that it has adverse childhood experiences, it's not like you can just leave the home. So you need to really develop these certain skills for survival. But then what tends to happen is that you don't necessarily grow out of these skills, even though you don't necessarily like need people for survival. You don't necessarily grow out of these behaviors unless you have very intentionally worked on them with a therapist or worked on them with a coach. But a lot of this work, I do this work with clients, but I will say that a lot of this work, should really be done in therapy with a trauma-informed therapist. How this looks in corporate environments and why corporations absolutely thrive off of a fawn trauma response is because if you're experiencing the fawn trauma response, you likely will not be able to say no. You likely will try to go above and beyond. You will try to please everyone. You will try to do every single project. You will be the go-to, the expert. And what this then looks like is really not advocating for yourself because there's a fear of retaliation, a fear of being caught out, a fear of someone figuring out that you're maybe not good enough, or you feel like it can actually feel like you're afraid of something that would happen in your childhood that's then going to happen in the workplace. So, really, you're kind of labeled as the reliable one, you're labeled as the go to. But sometimes then, because you're not usually people with a fawn trauma response are usually not advocating for themselves. So they're not the ones that are asking for raises. They're not the ones that are asking for promotions. They're the ones where, oh my God, and I see this a lot. Oh my God, I got a 2% salary increase. And it's like, oh, really? Well, you were working fucking 65 hours a week. Yeah, you should get that 2% salary increase. So fawners aren't necessarily going to be the ones that are the troublemakers on the team. They're usually not going to be the loudest voices. A lot of times they're going to feel scared about speaking up. Their voices aren't usually the ones heard. They are more of kind of the executors on the team. People, and I was looking through research of this and looking at research of are people with adverse childhood experiences, so ACEs, which are more likely to cause trauma responses, such as the fawning response and complex PTSD. So though like people with higher or at least one adverse childhood experience, and also if you're curious about what it's called an ACE score. I think 11 questions that you can answer, and these are adverse childhood experience, such as did one of your parents leave the home? Was anyone in prison? Was there an addict in your life? Were you abused physically, sexually, or emotionally? So you will likely get a score at the end. So people with higher ACE scores, between 4 to 10 ACEs, were more likely to experience burnout, compassion fatigue, and lower workplace well-being. I think I might score a 3 or a 4 on the ACE test. And when I found out about this and then was looking at the correlation between burnout and the correlation between, overgiving and adverse childhood experiences, it's no doubt that or total makes total sense that I burned out so severely at 30 years old that I had to stop working for a year and a half. And I remember speaking to the woman that replaced me. Shout out Clara, if you are listening to this podcast. And she replaced me, and I would just like give and give and give and had really no boundaries with work. And, I was also in an extreme fawn trauma response with a lot of different people in my workplace. And I remember asking Clara, like, yeah, how's the job? And she was like, yeah, it's grand. Like, it's fine. And I was just like, oh my God, that same job completely burned me out. So, very similarly, as to if you look at PTSD and how PTSD will develop in certain people but not others, burnout is kind of the same. You could take the same job and you could take the same types of things, but if you come from this place of all of your different type of responses, like the fawn trauma response of trying to overgive, overplease, appease, you then are more likely to burn out. What this means, it's like, oh, is all hope lost? And definitely no, like all hope is not lost here. But I will caveat and say, like, this is not overnight work. This does take a lot of dedication. This does take a lot of persistence. And the fawn trauma response used to be a huge default of mine. I remember one time, this was years ago, but I had a manager and he pulled up a bikini photo of me in a one-on-one, and he was, like, zooming in on it, and I was so uncomfortable at the time, and I was just like, "Oh my god, what is going on?" And then I went and I spoke to my therapist about it, and I was, like, crying to my therapist, and so I remember speaking to my therapist about it, and I was in her office, I was being harassed, and I didn't really know what to do, but then a few days later, I just had this urge to write my boss an email about how he was such a great manager to me. It was like I couldn't even really control it. And that is the fawn trauma response. And sometimes it's impulsive, it's not logical, you can't control it. You may feel feelings of shame because you're basically placating behavior that is not acceptable, but just know that you can get out of it and you can work through it. And I highly suggest that if you are experiencing something like this, you do seek help, whether that's with a therapist or whether that's with, a certain type of program. So here are steps that you can take. And this is not necessarily in the therapeutic work, but tools that you can take. So first with the response. So with awareness is the first time you're aware of something, that is the key. The first step of any sort of change is awareness. However, what I do see a lot of the time is people getting stuck in an awareness loop and not necessarily taking any type of action. So just be sure that if you are aware of something, you want to really take action. So one is the awareness of like, what's your default yes? When do you agree to things that you actually want to say no to? And that could be both big and little things. So this could be, I was speaking with a client about this, about like saying yes to plans that you don't really want to do. So saying yes to things, whether it's going to a birthday party or whether it's, going to drinks with your friends when you're actually trying not to drink, or maybe you're doing IVF treatment or something like that. When are you saying yes and feeling obligated to things when you want it to be a no? So start tracking those things, and you don't necessarily have to do anything, but really start to track everything. And the challenge would be eventually is to say no to lower barrier things. So I would say that if you have a really tense relationship with your mother or with your father, starting to say no to them as the first, as your first practice test of like, I'm not going to fawn anymore, like that's way too big of a mountain to climb. So start to say no to smaller things and just see how that feels. Now, it will feel very uncomfortable. And like any new habit, especially with this one, there is always some sort of afterburn, especially if you're a person where you're constantly appeasing. I talk about this in the episode How to Set Boundaries Without Feeling Like a Bitch. It was one of the first episodes. That's definitely a good one to go back to and re-listen to or listen to again for the first time. What I would also do is prepare yourself with some scripts. And I actually have a boundary script worksheet. So DM me with the word boundary. I'm more than happy to give that to you. But prepare yourself with scripts of things that you would actually say, which is, hey, let me think about that. Or, hey, I just need to check my calendar before committing. Let me know. Or, hey, I actually want to look at my workload and get back to you. Can I get back to you before agreeing to that? So pausing is a super important skill to practice, especially if you have more of a fawn response. So pausing, taking 24 hours to get back to some things. For example, I used to say yes to things and then, instantly kind of wish that I hadn't. And now it's like I don't really commit to a lot. And I got invited to a birthday party. And it would definitely be really fun. But I got invited to a birthday party. It's the week before my family arrives before my wedding. There's probably things I'm going to have to do for the wedding. And, it's just going to be a full on week. So actually, it was like I waited 24 hours and then I actually said, hey, I'm not going to be able to come, rather than having to overcommit, canceling the day of, feeling a sense of shame, feeling sense of guilt, feeling like a lot of stress in my body because I committed to something that I couldn't realistically go to. So it's like understanding, when are you setting yourself up for failure as well, and how can you really stop doing that? Another really big thing, especially in the fawn trauma response, understanding like how to stop fawning, is a lot of somatic practices. So in her book Fawning, Dr. Ingrid talks about how do we really get back into the body. And so some easy ways to do this is, can you wash your hands with super cold water? Can you start to hum, which then stimulates the vagus nerve? Can you do practices like yin yoga or do somatic tracking or yoga nidra? Like, what type of somatic practices? And when we talk about somatic, if you don't know what that means, somatic practices mean just getting into your body. So usually if you have the fawn response, you'll be quite heady, which means you'll be in your head a lot. You'll probably be overthinking a lot. You'll probably be really hyper vigilant. So how can you get out of your head and into your body? One of my clients, she's just made so many beautiful moves, but she started a yoga practice and just yoga. And she's actually doing a yoga teacher training. You know who you are, Sarah. I'm so happy for you. She's actually doing a yoga teacher training. So great example of how to get more into your body as well. Things like looking at any type of hobby with physical movement or also any type of meditative hobby. Like I love doing puzzles or you could like knitting, but anything that's slightly tactile that uses your hands is a really good idea. The next thing is like understanding using internal family systems. So if you work with me, if you're either in my private coaching practice or you're on level 1 or level 2, a lot of what I do is internal family systems based and looking at reading Dr. Ingrid's book on fawning and, just how interested I am in this type of trauma response. And then when she was saying a lot of what you can do is use IFS, internal family systems therapy, to understand, what is the part of you that does the fawning response. And it usually will be a childlike part. And what's so interesting is that you will have a part, and that part could be 8, it could be 5, or it could be 13, where it learned somewhere along the lines that it's not safe for me to speak up. I have to be constantly aware of mom or dad's movements. I have to constantly be scanning. I have to constantly appease, and it's not safe for me to do anything else. Now, then that 8-year-old or that 5-year-old or that 13-year-old, that is the one that's usually showing up in the corporate setting. If this stuff is unprocessed, it is definitely still showing up and impacting how you are working today. So this is why it's extremely important to get self-knowledge and to understand what's going on with your system so that your life isn't being run by a fucking 8-year-old. So what you can do there is really turning inward and asking yourself the questions of, why is this part here? What's this purpose? What can I do to help this part get through it? What does this part need from me today? And this is a process in IFS. It's called unblending, where a lot of people will think, and usually when people first come to me, they'll say, oh, I'm just a people pleaser. I'm a people pleaser. I'm not confident. I have poor executive presence, blah, 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 whatever bullshit that they've been told by some manager who gave them like really shitty feedback. So they just kind of list off all of these things. And in the process of internal family systems therapy, IFS, which is, for those of you that don't know, my last episode was on internal family systems therapy. Highly recommend listening to that if you haven't listened to it. It's founded by Dr. Richard Schwartz, and it's looking at what are the different parts of you that were founded as a protective mechanism that are still kind of wreaking havoc on your life today, and how can we understand those parts, soothe those parts. We don't want to shun them. We don't want to say, you're not good, you're not welcome here, let's just put you on the shelf, let's get rid of you, because then what actually happens is then these parts tend to act out stronger. And one of my beautiful clients said to me last week, it was the wrap up of one of my level 1 cohorts, and she said, in every other course I've done or every other type of modality, it's usually like these parts of you are bad, we have to get rid of them. How do we minimize these parts of you that are somehow deemed unworthy in some way, and then like maximize these other parts of you that are more productive, that are more confident, that are more ambitious, whatever it is. And in IFS, we are absolutely not trying to do that. We are not banishing parts, even if there are parts of you that you hate. And you might be like, I hate this people pleaser part of me. I hate the part of me that, is constantly saying yes to things when it says no. I hate the part of me that puts up in really shitty relationships that I don't want to be in. And that's okay. But what we want to do is really understand why the part is there. Thank the part, understand that it is a protector part. It's there out of protection for a certain way, and really start to befriend it, bring some compassion to it, let it feel your presence, but then also really ask, what do you need from me as an adult? Like, what do you need from me? And really being there for your part is going to be that's a process of unblending. So, okay, this isn't me. I'm not a people pleaser. I'm not someone that's low confident. That's not confident. I'm not someone poor executive presence, or I'm not someone that just can't say no. That's actually a part of me. That part was built for survival. I need to understand that part, deactivate that part so that I can be in the adult self and actually make decisions from a strong and grounded place. This is what we do. So a lot of what I do in the life and work transformation is working with, a lot of people pleasing parts. While I do not work with trauma directly, I can't say that enough. A lot of these responses do come up in coaching. Sometimes as well, a few of my clients do also work with a therapist, especially I'm thinking of, a few in particular who they will be working on this stuff simultaneously with a therapist, processing trauma that happened. And with me, it's more like action and accountability. With me, it's like, okay, this is being processed with a therapist, but how is this showing up when your boss asks you, or when a stakeholder asks you, that you need to get on 6 a.m. meetings 3 days of the week, but you also have 9 p.m. meetings and you can't say no. How do we start to negotiate that with your system? How do we tell that part of you that it's okay? It's okay. You're here for it, but actually you're not going to work those hours, and there has to be some flexibility in working between different regions. That's where a coach can really come in and help you with things. So this is kind of how it shows up for me in the life and work transformation. To just recap this, I just always want to say, like, you are not broken. If you feel like I'm a people pleaser, I want to change it, this is so, so common. And just know that it can change, it can transform. The first step really is identifying and understanding what's going on, what the awareness is, and then how we move past it. Also, I will say I would love to get Dr. Ingrid Clayton on the show. So if anyone knows her, please hit her up on behalf. I'm going to be messaging her as well. I would love for her to come on. She's definitely a really big dream guest of mine. I will really be looking out, for that. And um, the life and work transformation. So the next round is open. It starts on October 30th. We already have an amazing cohort. This is my last round for the year. So if if you want to work with me this year, this is your last opportunity to, because also all my one-on-one spots are full right now. So this is the only way you can work with me for the rest of the year. I highly encourage you guys, especially if, you're working with this type of response and it's something that you want to change and you want help with the behaviors around that. That is something that I can help you with as a coach. So big fucking dreamers, thanks so much for being here with me today. And I will see you all in 2 weeks.